Good evening, everybody. I'm Julia Block. Welcome to the 21st Annual Fellows Program. Coming to you live, although not from the Kelly Rader's House Arts Cafe. We are conducting our social distancing edition of the Fellows Program with Erín Moure tonight, and coming to you from Philadelphia, Montreal, and many, many other places respectively. So tonight, Erín Moure joins us as our second fellow of 2020, and although this is not by any means her first visit to the Penn community or with the Penn community, we've been thrilled to dive very deeply into her work over the last several weeks in the Kelly Rader's House Fellows class, which is the learning community that anchors the Fellows program before we open up these visits to the public, which we're doing in this moment, in this live stream. So the first thing I want to do is thank Erín for making the work available to us for many weeks of intensive study and engagement. And the intensity of that study was made even more intensive by our current global moment, which involves students leaving campus suddenly and reconvening themselves in virtual and remote learning communities. I also want to quickly thank Lily Applebaum, who's been coordinating the Fellows program for the last several years and working closely with our students and our fellows on all the logistics that go into bringing writers to us for visits, and who also made really extraordinary efforts this time in particular to reimagine and redesign what this visit would look like now that we are virtual, to make it as inclusive as possible. And I want to thank especially Anna Safford for helping us teach this class and helping us get our course working through screens and cameras and keyboards. And I want to thank Paul Kelly, who has made it possible since 1999 for the Kelly Writers House to bring 3 eminent writers to campus each spring and to maintain the intimacy of that space throughout the span of those visits, both in the class and in the public venue. And finally, thank you to the members of the Writers House Fellows class who are joining us virtually tonight, who dove into this work with enthusiasm, curiosity, courage, and a great spirit of openness, especially given the challenges that we're all facing during the pandemic. So a few logistics about tonight. Erín Moure is going to read for us and then answer our questions. I'll be moderating that Q&A along with Lily and Anna. If you're on Twitter, you can post questions using the hashtag #ErinMoureLive. If you're watching us on YouTube, I invite you to comment on that YouTube stream. If you are part of the ModPo community site, there is a dedicated discussion forum for questions for Erín Moure. I'm going to introduce Erín Moure. So in the Fellows class this semester, as I mentioned, we have worked through the electrical monopoly of Erín Moure's lyric excesses and procedural forays into an investigation of borders, citizenship, relation, sexuality, power, translation, signal, and noise. And before the lights went out at Penn, we read everything from her 1988 book Furious to 2017's Planetary Noise. And we created lists of what makes this poetry and translation work productively difficult, politically invested, and aesthetically urgent. And after the lights went out at Penn, our class scattered to our various homes and dormitories and house shares and reconstituted ourselves in Canvas and Zoom and began to make sense of what it means to read Moure's work in a learning community that is virtual and yet somehow also tethered by a shared history of learning together in a room. That the contours of our study of Moure's work are now structured by social distancing in a way illuminates one of the most fruitful aspects of her own practice. In the preface to My Beloved Wager, Moure writes, "This practice is influenced by feminism and has a stake in it. And it's influenced by asthma, by allergy, by sexuality, by the somatic, by all that can't be ignored on pain of numbness or loss of consciousness." Here, during the time of pandemic in which each of us can't ignore both the vulnerabilities of the body and the capacities of the body to do a kind of language practice as social distancing, we find ourselves reading and writing together at an intimate distance, carving out different shared spaces as against all that can't be ignored. Even though Erín goes on to say in that same preface that hers is, quote, not a recommendation or a map for another's writing or reading practice, end quote, in a way we have taken it just as that, a somatic mapping of social processes such as identity formation, cultural differences, citizenship, and belonging, a list that might be offered by cultural geographers. And we're absolutely thrilled that Moure joins us in this space tonight for a reading and a Q&A, as our Kelly Writers House learning community necessarily enlarges to include all of you. Please help me welcome Erín Moure.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this reading. I can't see you, but I can sense you out there. Good afternoon, good evening, good night. And para os amigos, as amigos en Galicia que escoiten, boas noites. Gracias por vir estar aquí conmigo. For my friends, mes amis francophones, merci d'être venus m'écouter ce soir. Et je vais continuer après ça en anglais. I want to thank as well the fabulous people at UPenn Kelly Writers House, Julia, Anna, and Lily, and Zach, in particular, and Al Philrice, who invited me back in late 2018, at a time in which it would have been impossible to imagine the current moment, for sure. It's a great honor for me to be a Kelly Writers House Fellow, and I hope all of you are washing your hands lots out there. Some of you may not have heard me read before, I'm not sure, or it's been a while, and so I thought I would just say a couple of things to start. The first thing that I will say is that I'm speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and of other nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, Huron-Wendat, and all sorts of, in a land that's full of history of many Iroquoian peoples. And that history and that persistence and resistance is one of this land and of its people who are its caretakers, stays with me and helps me resist in this current moment of difficulty. I just wanted to say to begin with that I've always loved poetry of all kinds ever since Mother Goose, especially limericks. But I've been told not to get started on limericks, so I have to just say limericks. I've always seen poetry as a way that language likes to play with our brains. And since brains are involved, of course, I see poetry as a mode of thinking through issues, emotions, presences, troubles, relations, possibilities, in language that logic doesn't fully take care of or handle. Because poetry involves sound, accent or accents, rhythms, plus it's the genre or the means that can best engage contradiction, paradox, and ambiguity, which are productive processes in poetry. Outside of poetry, those three things, paradox, contradiction, and ambiguity, are part of everyday life, but they're often seen as something troublesome to be kicked aside. Poetry uses those means to think further, and that gives us all, either listening or being part of poetry in some way, it gives us all an enhanced ability to live with those three things and work with them. Makes life better, if you ask me. So, as a mode of thinking, poetry, like sheltering in place, is something that we do, a poet does, a listener does, not just for themselves, but for and through and among community. And that large community, not just a small community of the people I know, but that large community that includes millions of people that I don't know and never will. As a poet, I've always wanted through my work to listen in that community, that bigger community, smaller communities, but also in the bigger community, to read from that community and to create work that contributes to the community. So it's even more stunning to me, just to conclude those prefatory remarks, to be part of the Kelly Writers House as a fellow this spring, and to be part, again, of the ModPo community as well, that brings the American poetry and histories of poetry and border crossing poetry to a whole world, and that listens to the world talking back about poetry. Often people from other countries, I know, we can sometimes find American poetry to be talking to itself, And it's just one impression that a person can be left with. ModPo, the course ModPo that Alphilris runs, and the people at Kelly Writers House show us that American poetry is an opening to the world, and is a really exciting place and a moving place to be. And it's a place that listens to people from everywhere. So just thank you again, Kelly Writers House. Thank you again, UPenn, and everybody who's made this possible. I'm going to start by reading a poem from my translation of Fernando Pessoa's Alberto Cairo's Guardador de Rebanhos, because somebody requested it. And I thought, why not? I'm going to read that poem. It's the first poem in the book. And in Portuguese, the poems are just numbered. They're not named. And the first poem in the book, which is called Guardador de Rebanhos, it's called The Keeper of Sheep in English, but I call it The Garter of Sheep, just because I like that word, guardar. In the first poem, Alberto Cairo lets us know that he's a little bit impish. The first poem starts out, Eu nunca guardei rebanhos, mas eu como sei os guardar. So that, which means, translated literally, a book called The Garter of Sheep, I never guarded sheep. What's he writing a book called I Guarded Sheep then? But it's as if I looked after them. I never looked after sheep, but it's as if I looked after them. I love that. My translation is called What Me Guard Sheep? And it's for a Canadian poet who's been a wonderful friend of mine for decades and decades, Phil Hall. Hi, Phil, if you're out there in Victoria, I'm reading your poem. What? Me? Guard sheep? I made that up. This is poetry. It's my soul that's sheepish, knows wind and sun, grabs onto every season and follows, looking. Nature's peaceful today, it's empty and it's my pal. But it saddens me. What if sunset turns my lights out too, when the parking lot goes cold and nightfall's butterfly presses at my body? Glass. But being sad isn't all bad. It's fair enough and natural. What else is a soul for? It's so sure it exists when the hand cuts flowers, it doesn't cry out. Like the racket of the mail truck coming around the curve of the avenue, my thoughts are happy. Yet simply thinking this makes me glum. For if they weren't happy, there'd be more variety. Instead of being happy and glum, they'd be joyful and happy. What the heck? Thinking bugs me, like walking in the rain when the bus goes by, a huge wind splattering dirty water, greasy water. Ambitions and desires? My head's wet. Being a poet isn't an ambition. It's a version of being alone. And if I sometimes want, I'm making this up, to be a lamb or to be a whole flock with a flock's funny gait on the hillside, one leg shorter than the other. It's just that I feel what I write at sunset or when a cloud's hand shields the light and my neighbor goes in after cutting the lawn. When I sit writing poems or when walking Vaughan Road or along the alley, I write poems in my head because that's how I think. The pen I hold is my shepherd's crook, and I see my own figure on the crest of Bathurst Street, guarding my flock and viewing my ideas, or viewing my ideas and guarding my ideas and viewing my flock, and smiling half goofy like my friend Phil. Hello to you, Phils of the future. I take my hat off to you. Look, I'm in my own doorway on Winnett, across from another parking lot. I hope you've got sun and rain when you need it, and that in your houses you have a chair and a window that opens, where you've just read this. It's a poem. And that reading it makes you think, I'm a natural. For example, an ancient tree that thrives on a buried creek where children plop down when they're sick of playing and wipe the heat off their sticky foreheads with the sleeve of a t-shirt, their striped t-shirts now wet in my striped shade. So that's Pessoa, Cairo, Moure. Some of the poems, I translated the poems in order to maintain the humor that was in the originals that was not quite visible. Yeah, it wasn't visible in a standard translation. Sometimes I do a lot of hyper translation. I translate excessively just to get what Pessoa is able to get in a very condensed area. So if we look at this, for example, I'm going to read this poem. So the original here is just a few lines, and this one is kind of logorrheic, we'll say. But I kind of like it. Some woman out there has a piano. Some woman out there has a piano. It's pleasant, but can't match the current of rivers, can't beat the murmurs composed by the trees. Why would anyone have a piano? What if you want to play a show tune no one likes? If you have ears at all, you can go outside instead and lie in the lawn. The dirty gray cat will come to visit and be scared of you. And you can go to the manhole cover and hear the creek run. So that's Sheep's Vigil, and a poem written in rural Toronto, north of St. Clair. People from Toronto know where that is and how it's not rural at all. So I'll follow those two poems with a couple of pages, poems from Occidental, which was a book that came out in the same time period. I wrote this book in 2000. It was published in 2001. I wrote this book from 1996 to 1999, and it came out in 2002, because you can't have two books out in 1 year in those days. Occidental, I'll just say, to save time and not allow myself to ramble, I'm just going to read off the back cover. A candid and passionate consideration of citizenship viewed through the feminine. Occidental examines borders in language and in the body, exploring ways in which we might rethink nation and community in our era. So I'm going to just read, I'm on page 77, for those of you who have the book, document 30, viable risk. And I think that it follows a love poem so the poem starts sex's relation, but you can really call it poetry's relation as well. Viable risk, poetry's relation to extend the boundaries of such interiority. But even to say boundaries implies a prior exercise of restraint upon belief or tabulation. Thus, necessary to examine restraint in another fashion as a kind of viable risk, where impingement actually makes force flow outward across a border, or impingement makes the force already there and the border visible. It's like staying at home. Just pointing that out. Like Heisenberg on particles visibility, when we think we see an interrupted trace, but it is our own sight, or we think we see an interrupted trace, but it is our own sight interrupting it. We see bits of light rebounding off the particle, not the particle itself. After I am a textile, you can dream. That textile is a surface formed of depths and surfaces, making yet another surface which can be folded, making non-proximate surficial zones concatenate in structure. She said, wielding zinc strip wire. Extension in space, the face or hair, and time, memory or the future that makes citizen possible. So face, problematic face, past, present. Citizen, you too. Cortical affect could be prosthetic gesture, demur, locality, a roof here. Concatenate, mesial, adrenaline, a bay dance, seal, which is the kind of chorus you find at the bottom of the poems in Village Loud. Document 31, La Repubblica. Recorded, there's a quote in here, just to start off with, from a government type of document in Europe. And normally I would put my hand to my mouth and imitate a megaphone. But since this is not what I want to be doing these days, putting my hand to my mouth, I've found this megaphone-like device of a contested consumer product. And when you see me use that, I'm quoting from a document. Recorded life. Document 31, La Repubblica. Recorded life, learned as considering the right to use a regional or minority language in private and public life is an unalienable right conforming to the principles embodied in the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and according to the spirit of the Council of Europe Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. But I return with the unsayable, says Clarice Lispector. The unsayable can be given me only through the failure of my language. Only when the construct falters do I reach what it could not accomplish. As I say, that's Lispector, the Brazilian famous, Brazilian, very important and wonderful modernist writer, in her book, The Passion According to G.H. And in a call for the stranger, for the neighbor only does what we can already read. Lispector again, I can love only the unknown evidence of things and can add myself only to what I do not know. Only that is a real giving of the self. All this in the face of the French fright in the spring of 1999 at signing a charter to protect regional European languages, fear for its own language of the Republic. Where did this fear come from, this Republic? For such charters so often give the right to speak a language without the right to have anyone listen. I was a timid fater, ipse you a juridique festuns demur. And there's a footnote there that says for and against Augustine's caritas, St. Augustine's caritas, or love of the neighbor. For that caritas stabilizes zone disequilibriums. In embracing the neighbor, difference is ghosted over. Most of the book is arguing against Augustine's caritas and in favor of Levinas' notion of the stranger, that too. And Derrida's notion of the gift, which is read through Levinas and the stranger. Sorry there. Often in my poems as well, there's we were talking about this afternoon, elements like this arrow that I can make in word. And what that serves to do is when you get to the end, you're brought back up to read in the middle of the poem. So I help the reader's eye to move around in the poem and read differently than they would otherwise. Document 32, inviolable. When my language fails, only then can we detect signals that hearken to a porosity of borders or lability of zones across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, not just the visual, as in planetary noise. But first we have to suspend our need to see identity itself as a saturate signal, obliterating all noise, and follow the spector into a not yet. How a woman wanting to write can be a territorial impossibility, and reading, bodies or others or texts, is itself always a kind of weak signal communication, a process of tapping signals that scarcely rise off the natural noise floor, like the noise generated by a system within itself. Think of Ingeborg Bachmann, the Austrian writer, in her hotel rooms. Her unsettled acts were noises fissures. To see her as citizen is indeed to know citizen as repository of harm, where harm is gendered too. Myths of violability, inviolability, volatility, utility, and lability played out. In wars, women are territories, and territories are sites of punishment. A César au que est de César, Bachmann in Rome. To interdepend, Clarice says, the noise generated by a system within itself. One more, there's 2 film scripts. They're both called Hazard No in the book. This one's 8 minutes long. Nobody's ever made it, but I'll read it to you. Hazard No. One, somebody, head and shoulders, white background, screams into the camera sentences in French from Jorge Semprun's Mal et Modernité on Heidegger and Nietzsche. 2, occasionally a voice says, stop, and she stops shouting and is seen in a cafe or on a patio eating and drinking in a group of people. The motion and interaction read as friends. We only hear snatches of the conversation. 3, then the text starts again, screaming. 4, these 2 alternate for 8 minutes. 5, the last screamed words from page 102. En fin de compte, ma patrie n'est pas la langue, ni la française, ni l'espagnol. Ma patrie, c'est le langage. 6, in a cafe, people are talking. Someone else has taken the place of the speaker, but is wearing the same clothes. 7, the end. And that script ends with a quote from Julia Kristeva that's in such small printing that if you're like me, you can hardly read it. The banquet of hospitality, says Kristeva, is the cosmopolitanism of the moment, the brotherhood of guests who soothe and forget their differences. The banquet is outside of time. It imagines itself eternal in the intoxication of those who are nevertheless aware of its temporary frailty. We know a lot about temporary frailty in this moment, that's for sure. So that's O Citadin, and thanks to the person who requested that I read from it. So that book was published in 2002. It was written up from 1996 to 1999. In the years in between, I decided to start to learn Galician, which is why I translated the Pessoa. I started to read Galician. I wanted to learn a bit of Galician. I was in a bookstore with my friend Maria Ramondes. Hola Maria, si estás allí, who's a wonderful writer and translator. And I wanted to buy some Galician children's books with cassettes and pictures so I could learn a bit of Galician. And then I came to the cash register and I saw this. It's like this velvety textured orange, and orange is my favorite color. And it said on it, Emetala Chus Pato. I didn't have a clue. So I opened it. And well, I've written all over it now, but I opened it, and throughout there was like these amazing, crazy differences of various texts. I realized it was a book of poetry, and I wanted to buy it. And Maria says, what are you buying that for? You can't read that. And I'm like, well, I want to translate it. I want to learn enough Galician to translate it. And she said, in her Maria way, you'll never learn enough Galician to translate Chus Pato. And so the next year I went, I worked half an hour each day trying to learn some Galician. I went the next year to the Curso para Extranjeros, in a Galician course for foreigners in Santiago de Compostela. And I learned some Galician. Nobody believed there either that I wanted to translate Chus Pato, but it was several years before I finally translated that book, and it came out from Shearsman Books. I'm just going to read one little poem from this particular book, and I wanted to read another couple from the book I translated after this book, Charanton, but of Patos, but it was published actually before this one. The poet, she gets all emotional, like more and further landscapes unfolding. Fourth voyage of the third prostitute of Qumran or sands that Mandelstam desired. Because I hear my voice in another and another voice in another. Such tiny trees. Nationalism is a question of identity. They rob you of your identity because that identity can't really exist. And you suffer all your life from the theft, trying to get restitution from them, staring straight at the thieves and trying to make them do you justice. The rebuilding of this identity, its impossible reconstruction, are the history of the nation and the history of the poem. I'm self-cryogenating in this non-place, tundra not opening, and shamanize yourself and flourish me. That poem's for Helena Gonzalez, and it speaks of Galician identity in a society where Galician identity and culture was suppressed. It's still, Galician language, you still can't go to school entirely in Galician in Galicia. You still can't sometimes phone for help in Galicia in Galician. lots to go there. Pato, one of the aspects of her poetry, I guess, is a difficult poetry, like my poetry. When it's one of the things that people sometimes speak of is make a binome between experimental poetry and the poetry of quietude, or the poetry of consolation. And I don't like actually the word experimental poetry. I've noticed from translating poetry that all poetry is experimental, but in some way, or else it's not. But Pato here ends this little piece with a binome that works for me, and says what her poetry actually does. It's written in the form of an interview. Madam, is what you write representative? Nothing represents. It produces. It searches out meaning. Nothing means. It functions. Does it have to do with a metaphysical language? No, with a transcendental language. Ideological? Oh, material. Eatable? No, schizophrenic. Imaginary? No, it has nothing to do with an imaginary idiom. It's a non-figurative language. Symbolic? No, real. Structural? No, machinic. Molar? Gregarious? No. Molecular, micropsychic, and micrological. Expressive? Productive. So that's Chus. I'll read one more here from Chus, which always cracks me up. Repertoire of Russian phrases to characterize a romantic, anarchic, and in the end nationalist muse. Authors abandoned or death-longing, but it was a lie. 44 equals 4 plus 4 equals 8 plus 1999 equals 1,674 equals 1 plus 6 plus 7 plus 4 equals 1 plus 8 equals 9 equals 6, hexagon. 44 equals 4 plus 4 equals 8 plus 1,666 equals 2007 equals 2 plus 0 plus 0 plus 7 equals 9 equals 6, hexagon. Or the cellular condition of the honey that nourished Pindar, under the mouth sky, underground tomb of the viceroy, all around you like weak maritime lightning, and the encounter at the white coral atoll and the viceroy gone mad. It was how Eugene imagined the resurrection. That emblem the poet keeps in her heart, the muse refuses. The reproduction of its face constructs a sky with rowboat splinters. On any seaside promenade, summer tourists. Certain Angelos or unreal ideas of the muse, his adoration by Emma Bovary, his opinions on the labor market and the work of women, the passion for crime as mathematical mechanism, the paternity of the muse, the absence of hope. Chimera will explain that without hope, the revolution is not possible. The clandestinity and physical mysteries of Eugene, the confusion between literature and truth, his physical and mental aging, the detention of time. Chimera and Maria dance on the mountainside, pursued by the heroine of galaxies and wee field birds who control the coffee shops in the port. They all duck into an 80s bar. Someone should really attend to the basic aspects of the syntax of my writing. Sharon Thon, Chus Pato. I guess I've translated, well, I'm still looking for a publisher for the 6th book, but I've translated all 5 of her books, her pentology, Pato's pentology, including Secession, which is mixed with my own work, Secession. Won't read from that right now. And I wish I had time as well to read from Paraguayan Sea, which is a wonderful translation that the very wonderful Nightboat published from Brazilian writer Wilson Bueno, who died in 2010. It's written in Portunhol, which is a border mixture of Portuguese and Spanish. And I translated it into Franglish, which is invented border mixture of French and English, hopefully readable in English. Anyways, I'd love to read you part of this. It's a praise of life. It's a journey. It's a hymn, and it's an entirely South American book. It's a really interesting book. It's covered, by the way, is by Montreal artist Vida Simon, who's a wonderful and amazing artist. You should follow her on Instagram because she puts up a lot of her drawings and things. And I really thank her for her support of my work. These, on my beloved wager, these paper shoes are Vida's as well. And she's also appears on the cover of The Unmentionable, her work. So another book that I don't have time to read from, but I would love to, is Au Resplendor, in which those of you who are interested in Elisa Sanpedrin, she writes over half this book. Elisa Sanpedrin is, I guess she's called a heteronym. I see her as a polynym and a past. She doesn't publish books. She just interferes in other people's books. So in this book, she's interfered with mine, and she's not interfering with my reading. So I'll point that book out to you. So I'm going to move now and read some poems from my most recent collection, which is The Elements, which shows on its cover a figure. This figure is the figure of good, the figure of Bonte, overlooking a completely ruinous landscape, which is Dresden in 1945, carpet bombed by the Allies the year before in an effort to get Nazi Germany to surrender. Because the Allies won, of course, this massacre of civilian populations was not ever kind of mentioned again. This picture meant a lot to me because it kind of represented for me the inside of my dad's brain with dementia, and the fact that what still dominates in a case of dementia is good. The Elements, reading from the back again, is a family book, a thinker's biography and poetry, and a polylingual homage. Poems by and about my late dad, accepting his dementia as a real way of thinking world and self in a struggle against invasive powers, are braced alongside poems invoking the struggle of Galician peasants against the invasion of the armies of Napoleon. And by braced, I mean the way you'd brace open the door with a pile of books. It's two heterogeneous elements that are brought together. And once heterogeneous elements are brought together, at times the brain starts going, and you start to see similarities. And I'm going to start off actually with some of the poems we didn't talk about at all. The Galician poems. The Galician army was in the Napoleonic Wars, beginning of the 19th century, was the army of the west part of Spain, was the army of Galicia. And they were sent off at first to stop Napoleon coming down from the Basque country. And they ended up getting their asses, bombs kicked, I don't know, getting kicked all the way down the road and losing every battle, pretty much. I learned about this from studying it because it was one of my father's obsessions, his absolute obsessions, and was the Napoleonic Wars and the Galicians. The English, John Moore came to try and rescue Spain from the French, and they decided to turn around and split in A Coruña because they thought, we're outnumbered, this is not going to work, and so they skedoodled. Using the Galician army as a rear guard was one of the main roles of the Galician army, is always to act as a tampon between one bunch of people shooting while the other people run away. Thanks, folks, for you. But Galicians were known as a result as pretty fierce fighters. Anyways, they ended up getting back to Galicia, but in rags. And I won't go on about that, but I'm just going to read a bit about the Galicians here. The Asturian division cut off at Zornotza. Blake's retreating Galicians abruptly turned on the pursuing French at Valmaseda to free their comrades. 2 days later, after 2 hours' fury at Gueñas, the advance of the 4th were overrun. Night fell and Blake pulled back to Espinosa de los Monteros, where on the 10th, joined by La Romana's Baltics, the Spanish forces that came down from the Baltics, His devanceros of the 4th held center with 6 guns until Blake's tactic of frenzy and attack in ruins, his half-famished brigands scattered pell-mell, abandoning caissons and fleeing in disarray, led then in tatters by Blake up cold Cantabrian passes to evade pursuit. Thousands imprisoned by the French were forced to Russia, not to return till Napoleon's defeat. Removed from command in favor of La Romana, who awaited troops to support the English, Blake rallied his hounded men south to Leon. Joaquin Blake, descendant of Irish who donned Spanish blue to shoot at the English. In Heidegger, the difference between essence and existence, thematized as ontological, between being and being, becomes the central problem of philosophy. That being abandons being means being cloaks itself in the manifest being of being. Being itself is essentially what dissimulates in absconding. Metaphysics, the primacy of being as being is abandoned. Blake's hideous aporia. His devanceros of the 4th had lost their guns, say some, or dragged them in frozen ruts alongside the miserable foot. O Lord, open now thy lips that they may give forth our praise. 31st of October to the 10th of November, 1808, Zornotza, Güeñes, and Espinosa de los Monteros. So there's all of the poems about the Galicians are mixed with philosophy. Defeated and shoeless, clothes in shreds or simply missing, Moors' sails long vanished over Biscay. The Galicians continued to emerge from the southern oaks and gorse west of Ribadavia to wreak havoc on the invaders, those Republicans of France whose armaments dwarfed theirs. Uniformless for 3 years after the defeats by Napoleon, Rio Seco, Zornotza, Güeñes, Espinosa, every town down the King's Road from Bilbao, and the retreat in frozen rags through the mountains. This is a quote. Exhausted, destitute, and ravaged by fever, every house we entered was full of those miserable beings, quite destitute of clothing and food. Behind Moors fleeing English, who turned to fight the French at Alvina and Coruña to save not even an idea of Spain, but themselves. A few soldiers later could be distinguished from locals. Thus, the peninsular origin of guerrilla warfare north of the Minho was curiously vestimentary. As in the vocabulary of ancient medicine, crisis designated the failing point when the illness had unrelentingly taken hold. Philosophy is one way to measure this, becoming human or destituted. To every name and existence in particular, unliquidated by dialectic. Aristotelian ontology is here directed towards hypostasis, it's being without attributes. La Romana's Galicians dispersed to the aldeas. To hold fast against the French invaders, they first had to round their slack intestines and find some shoes. 3 years later, at Coruña by ship and packed south by mule, bolts of uniform cloth arrived at last, and tailors. And January 1809, absque vestitu, with no clothes. So there's several poems like that, mostly at the beginning and a few further in the book. I'll read now a poem from page 24 called Purpose, which is actually delineates my purpose in writing the book. To draw text as one draws water from the zone beneath the house. To articulate all the texts of a life as they arise, not separating them into poems and essays, creating spaces for words on pages as if they were walks or benches, drinking coffee, drinking another coffee, sun on the wall, just sun. The poem that follows that is called Free Speech, and it does come from a talk that I gave in Chile. It was written polylingually, but I had to turn it into English because my simultaneous translator was only translating from English. Free speech. To start, I am obliged to speak in English. Already the structure consumes me. I may write in any language I like, as long as it is Castilian or English. And so I am already speaking to you in translation, in a foreign tongue, slowly, so I can be translated to you all. And I have to keep speaking in English, because now that the simultaneous translator is assigned to me to hear my English and make Castilian Spanish for you, I can't empezar de falar galego et je ne peux parler en français non plus. Je dois modifier mes propres discours. I must modify my speaking and translate for you in order that I may be translated. If, as Derrida says in Comment ne pas parler, the risk is inscribed in the structure, then I would add, the banality of power is already inscribed in the monolingual structure of our exchanges today. And that poem is from Maria Ramondes and Uliana Wolf, both wonderful writers and translators. And then there's a poem later on. It's kind of written back to front with, as if you could tear it out of the book because it's not the right color of paper. Articulating the shaking. If multilingual is to speak +1 languages serially, polylingual is to speak +1 languages concomitantly. It acts to induce or permit thought or affect not possible in a single and flattened linguistic realm. Did we try to dissipate what we were or were to know? A were to knowing is a plurality, where verbs move not bidirectionally, translation, but across multiple differential planes, Occitan, thought out polylingually. Yet we inhabit the monolingual paradigm of translation in which, this is via German poet Uliana Wolf bringing Turkish German Yasemin Yıldız's thinking into Musqueam, Salish, Vancouver, where I wrote this. Monolingual means we verse one language into one other, where it confronts the unilingual, in which only one language exists as an infinity pool or anthem with no horizon. Articulating the tunnel as shaking or cave. Against both mono and uni lies the polylingual, which is to translate an alternate memory embedded in the poems, to quote Wolf, an embedding which thus awaits the cellular metabolism of the translator, whose mitochondria are articulating the cave or shaking. Paddles raised in unison, standing in the boats. And there's an image of paddles raised there. So there's a lot in this book in which the polylingual life or communication devices, the devices that aren't just that infinity pool of English, are staged as an alternate way of thinking, but placed on a basis that's not that's similar or compared to or relates to the basis of my dad trying to think himself when he was in through his dementia. I'll read one of his little bits here. The first stanza of which is a quote from him. I used to sit beside him for a long time and he would just snooze and then he'd wake up and sometimes he would say something super cogent. So this poem's called I Am What I Am. I Am What I Am. Which, spinach and all that. It's not that I don't know who I am or what time it is. That went a long time ago, he implies. It's that I don't know what I am or if there is an I to have an am. I wake up and think I must be dead. Yet there is no I thinking that. The thinking of thought's thinking is thinking me forward. Close quote. He gets up after that and puts on his clothes over and over so that his body will come back into the arms of a shirt, another shirt, a jacket, 2 briefs, 2 sweaters. The sewn shares its substance with him. His substance, Bill, once neural, is now vestimentary, threaded, at home. So that's a bit from my pop. And I had a request to read another poem from here, which I will read. I have a feeling it's coming up. There it is. It's called Measure for a Long Wound. Wednesday was such a bad day. I'm thinking of thinking and thinking under the currently thought circumstances of thinking. I got up at 2:30 a.m. to read Frank O'Hara. I took 2 aspirins for headache. We were falling off the porch laughing last night. Whom I believe in. There are ambiguities in this life that are, as Ken would say, entirely beautiful. Wanting only to be adept at what I do, I compress all of it, even time. Trying to get words out of the head as fast as possible before they vanish. The lake rises under the storm. I don't mean any lake. I mean this lake, Lake Limu. Swollen water pouring over a tilted bed of stone. It's weak stone anyway. It's old seashore. It crumbles. We can only lie down in the tents of our minds, our chests upward breathing and legs touching the sheet cotton. 2 legs whole, the fans moaning, stir the heat up. We humans, it was us invented sunbathing and the word strafe, the words civilian population, the word person. Animals look at us dumbfounded. Aren't we all the same? So I wanted to read, at least point out and read one poem from this book that just came out, published by Louise Press. It's a translation of an incredible poet from Galicia, a very important 20th century poet, Uxío Novoneyra, whose work, maybe little bits of it exist here and there, but nothing has really been translated from him before. It's he writes, comes from this landscape, the high Corel mountains, with these very tilty, high, small fields that have been cultivated since late Neolithic times, since the beginnings of European cultivation, really. Just to read from the back again, Uxío Novoneyra was one of the greatest Galician poets of the 20th century. He was devoted to his region, the mountainous Corel, to its variant of Galician, and to its names and ways, as well as to Galician culture and language as a whole. He defended the expression of minority cultures everywhere and there, and our freedom from imperialism, war, and capitalists' expansionist oppressions. He was an eco-poet before the concept existed. Maybe he even invented it. He wrote and rewrote one great book all his life, Os Eidos, the Uplands, from which most of these poems are drawn. So I'm just going to read a couple of poems from here and then return to one last one from the Elements. With face pressed to the pane of the window, I watch threads of water against the shadows of crags. In the threads of water, already unseen, the gaze rests again, absorbed in rain. Threads of water, warped to the weft of dream threads, I am dreaming. So that's and the first poem in the book, Conjuring the Corel, is mostly a list of names of places and sites and natural features in the Corel, so it sounds almost the same in English as it does in Galician. Gotta go to Pia Pacharo, to Boco do Faro, lay me down in the Campo da Lucenza in the clear. Gotta go to the Devesa da Rogaira, and to Donis, to Rabola, to Pinza, and to the Chao do Caris. Gotta go to Loxada, and to Passios do Senhor, to Santaya, to Vega de Forças, and on to Fonlor. Gotta go to Cebrero and pass through the Ñares, climb up to Eribio, to Cervantes, and then Cares. Gotta go to Sido and to Castro do Brio, descend and walk by the banks of the Rio. Gotta go to Seramo, cross the Faro, and then head down the mountain to Valencia and Leon. Once out to Pena de Aresha, and Valles I've been, I'll head alone to an upland where I cannot be seen. He also wrote ergo poetry, ergograms, which this one reads, Corel dos tesos cumes que oyen de longe, e que sente se bengo poco que muove. Corel of high peaks that gaze from afar, here it truly hits you how a man's a paltry thing. If you could be there, that's what you would feel. So this book is just freshly out. And I'm going to close by reading this poem that everybody always requests, Birthday. I actually wrote this many years ago, or 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, or maybe 10. And every year I change one thing in it. And so since next month I'm turning 65, I'm changing it again. Birthing. I think I was awash in a sea of birds. Verbs were why I wrote. I wrote to rid myself of verbs. Trials were alphabets. I found myself guilty. I found myself alone, scraping letters in Edmonton on a granite stone. I was 17, just barely. I think I was awash in a dream of verbs. Birds circled over roofs that sheltered me. I've tried to follow you, grave verbs, all my life, with a yellow notebook through the east of Europe, the far east of Europe, Gethsemane, nearly Asia. And I am 65 and I am 17, and dear verb, next year, if I am alive, I will turn 20. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Erín Moure. I'm going to adopt the Zoom convention of waving my hands like this in lieu of actual applause to save the sound, save the impact on my mic.
You could always open another protein bar.
Yeah, I'll open another protein bar, rustle my papers a little more. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Sorry about how that happened in the beginning. Thank you. Thank you for that incredible reading. Joining me to moderate our Q&A are Lily Applebaum and Anna Safford, who will be popping up in the windows very shortly. And they're moderating questions coming to us from the public, from the YouTube channel, from Twitter, from email, from ModPo. And before we open up to some of those questions, I would love to ask you about your choices in assembling the set list for tonight. So when we spoke a few weeks ago, you suggested that you've always wanted to basically read requests, like get some requests for what to read and put together a reading based on requests from others. And the requests, in fact, poured in when we solicited them from poets in Philadelphia, from our students, from other folks we knew who would be tuning into this reading. So I'd like to ask you to say a little bit about what's important to you about reading for an audience in that way, asking for requests, putting together a set list, and perhaps also you mentioned that poem that you ended on, Birthday, is something that is frequently requested. So a larger question about putting together a reading in that way, curating a reading in that way as it relates to your practice overall, and then maybe your thoughts on Birthday, what seems to touch people about that poem.
Well, to address the question of the set list and the requests, really, I prepare readings and then they change from the time I prepare them, the time I give them, they change, partly because I'm in the presence of the audience, or people will come up to me and talk before the reading, or there's a meal before the reading, or a class, like we had the class this afternoon with all these amazing people with their interests and their approach to things. And so I start to realize what's important to the people in the room. And then I shift my reading a bit in order to engage with some of the things that they feel are important to them in their practice or in their current thinking. In the case of this techno amazement that allows me to be at Cali Writers House with, eating my own soup in Montreal, I'm reading, I know I'm going to read and I'm not going to see anybody, like I'm far enough away from the computer that I don't actually see myself very clearly either, but I don't see my audience. I don't see you. And I didn't want that to be alienating. I didn't want to just be spouting off here with no connection with the audience. And so it's my new Zoom technique is to get some requests. And I'd like to thank everybody who did write in with requests. Even though the reading would be like 3 hours long if we read all the requests. So I had to kind of jump, but definitely I didn't intend to read from Sheep's Vigil, and I wasn't going to read from O Citadin either. I was going to read from O Resplendor, and I was going to do something completely different. And then, some of the suggestions and even some of the questions that were sent made me think, I have to put some more Chus Pato in here, or things like that. So it was very much, it was enjoyable to me in my house here to feel like there was a public and an audience to whom I could respond.
Well, and in fact, you say in one of the essays in My Beloved Wager that we learn not just by reading, but in dialogue with others. And you say that as a very devoted reader, as someone who also describes how you never leave the house without a book in hand, and reading is absolutely essential to the dailiness of your life's practice. But there's a way in which you're obviously thinking about the intense relationality of the act of reading as a poet, and especially how that takes on maybe added significance or textures when you're in fact reading into your webcam. Can't see us out here, those of us who are in the Zoom meeting with you now muted our faces, which is a funny thing to say, but that's the language of the app. And then everyone else watching, of course, we know in the abstract that you're all out there, but we can't in fact see you.
Yeah, you have to send a tweet or something and say hi, you people. Otherwise, I'm not going to even know you're there.
Yeah.
Well, I guess some people will say to me, and some people did send me messages earlier today. So like, hi, Jack and Vita, for example.
Yeah, so in theory that people are out there.
Yeah, they claim to be out there.
Yeah.
So
I know we have a lot of comments coming up on the YouTube channel. I want to turn to Lily.
Oh, sure.
And I'm hoping that you'll be willing to share something that's coming up on that channel.
Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for your reading. It was amazing.
Thank you.
I am going to combine two questions that are similar, one from Tell It Slant on YouTube and one from Alyssa Haywood on YouTube. So Tell It Slant asks, how does learning a language to translate poetry impact your approach to language learning? And so that's Tell It Slant's question. And Alyssa's question, how does the work of translation influence how you write in English? So I think related questions there.
Well, I think that the work of translation, there's one reassuring thing about the work of translation. I just got a message. Hi, Juana. The work of translation puts me really deeply into the poem, sometimes far more deeply than the original poet who wrote it. I spend more time on their lines and on than they ever did writing it. But there's also a reassuring aspect to translating, because I don't have to start with a blank page. I start with their page, and then I just get totally lost in it. I love translation. I can go and worry and fret. These past couple of weeks, I'm a lot calmer now, but in part thanks to being in Canada and our Canadian government's response to the pandemic has been consistent and has made sense to me. So I'm calmer now. But I was able to go into translating a poem, and it's like jumping into a pool of wonderful water, like you're just in the pool. You hear sounds from the pool. So I'm just in the poem and trying to make English words of it. I've gone off your question, but I remember the other part of the question was, how does learning a language to write poetry affect my ways of learning language?
Yeah, how does learning a language in order to translate, like you were mentioning, learning Galician in order to translate, what was the process of, how does that impact how you learn other languages going forward?
Well, first of all, one of the things I know, because I already knew French in English, that there's that once you learn in one more language, learning the second language, oh my God, is it hard? Learning the third language is a lot easier, because you have to give up your position as being an adult master of language, and you become an infant, again. And that never really bothered me. The first time you have difficulty with that, once you get that out of your head, then you can learn it. And then learning Galician was, I had to learn Galician in all kinds of circumstances, and I learned by being in Galicia and by trying to say things that nobody understood and things like that. And I had to go to the course and stuff in order to, and then it took me, the first book I translated of Pato's, Metala, took me like 5 years to translate. I was so slow, I had to look up every second word. And not only that, but then there was no English Galician dictionary 20 years ago. I had to look up the Galician word in a Spanish Galician dictionary, and then I would go to the Spanish English dictionary. By then we were kind of like half lost, but my knowledge of French, of course, helped because as my French corrector keeps telling me, Galician is 17% French. So, I mean, it's a Romance language. So I was able to learn that. But also I just had the attitude, can I read a poem from here? Am I allowed?
Absolutely.
It's just from the beginning of this. This is where I was telling you, if you wanted to read this yourself, you could. Elisa Sampedrin in this book translates Romanian poems by Nikita Stănescu, who is translated properly by Oana Vasilikoe, who just popped up on my message here. And at a certain period of my life, when my mom was ill, I couldn't write. I was in another city. I was in Calgary. My friend, poet Oana, fellow poet, would send me a Stănescu poem every day, and then I would translate it without knowing any Romanian. But then I realized after a while that it was kind of working for me, and that it was actually Elisa Sampedrin translating. So this is Elisa Sampedrin. I can't explain why I was so suddenly drawn to translation, but surely it was the poems of Stănescu. In Bucharesti, in a bookstore, or on the street, the din. Or I was standing in a hallway, someone's hall. Whose? And I slid the book off a shelf. It had such a worn cover, pale yellow. I intended to put it back the instant the feet sounded in the corridor. But when I gently opened the book, I saw cattle. An eyeful of cattle. Their field was steaming. It was after a rain. A man was hammering on a stone. He wasn't watching me at all. He was so intent. I heard feet then. The book slipped into my coat. One gesture, but my mouth hurt. I raised my eyes then and took the book out and held it to the waiting woman. She turned to the shelf and back to me without saying anything. I knew I had to translate it. I knew no Romanian, but I wanted to read the book, so I had to translate it. There would be no surcease until I did so. So that's why you learn another language, because you have to translate the book.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Anna Safford, I think that you have a question that came in from our colleague, Davy Niddle.
I do. Hi, Erin again. Hi, everybody. This question came to us via email from the wonderful Davy Niddle, who's a poet himself and also a PhD candidate at Penn. Just a really wonderful person whom we love a lot. And Davy was interested in hearing not only you read from Occitan, which you did. He writes, he's been thinking about so much over the past few weeks. And Occitan has put such an unsettling spin on already unsettling ideas about globality. And Davy's also interested to hear you, Erin, talk about how you think about global capitalism in dialogue with your work. It would be great to get your take on the kind of position experimental poetry and your work in particular can strike in opposition to racialized systems of capital. What tools does experimental poetry offer us for understanding the global flows of racial capitalism? How might we use poems to negotiate the present violence and violent legacies of globalized power?
I think those are all like powerful questions that Davy's asking. And so I hope you folks out there, I hope you have nothing more to do before midnight or 6 a.m. if you're in Spain. Those are all questions that I can totally understand coming up, because those are key questions. That I have to go back though, just backpedal a little bit to what I was talking about this afternoon, that I have sometimes trouble with the word experimental, because experimental is one of those things that can be used as a club to hit people with or not. And from on either side, everybody can grab that club and hit the other person with it. So I prefer to think of poetries as ways of opening opening to possibility, going past those logical or instrumentalized uses of language to find and locate new spaces. In Pato's poetry, she writes from a position of the subaltern speaker of a minoritized language in a country where, sometimes you can't even, on Sunday, you can't even phone the fire department to say there's a forest fire in Galician, because on Sundays the phones get forwarded to Madrid and there's nobody there who can speak Galician to you. Things like that. You can't speak your own language in your own house, in your own place sometimes. And so she comes from a place of resistance, and also a place from where people always had to emigrate, from where people were poor. And thus she's another writer who is resistant to the forces of capitalism, not necessarily by opposing them. In her nature, she's opposed to them, but her work is doing some other work. Her work refuses to do the work of capitalism, and it refuses even to do the work of opposing capitalism. It does another work. And then hopefully, like capitalism loses some power, because things that go up, capitalism is infinitely absorptive as a system. That's why it exists everywhere. That's actually one of its appeals to people, is that it absorbs new ideas, it absorbs this and that. That's on one level, it can appeal to people because of that. On the other level, all protest, this gets reabsorbed. Somebody will give you a grant for this, And we see that time and time again. But Pato, and here, Ron, if you're there, I'm answering your question too. She works to about why Pato is an important poet. She works to undermine those forces of capital by doing something else, by making language open to other possible thoughts about what is a muse, what is a poet, and how we can move, how we might be able to move forward. And I think that, to go back to me, where I see myself as speaking in and through as part of a community, when one person you can open the door to a new possibility. For a while, you can hold a space of resistance open, but then something else has to happen. Otherwise it gets absorbed. So you're kind of in this, it's like you're kind of in this bubbling stage. You're at the edge. You're where things are, as Pato says, at the limit. Where's my little book here? I show this cover, this essay that she wrote, that poetry works at that limit, but it opens up possibilities in another way. But no one person and one poet, I can't speak to that. I can't do these things by myself. We all have to be working in language in ways that move thought in those kind of directions,
Kind of related to that, Erin, and I want to jump in here before I turn back to Lily, who I think has another question from the YouTube thread. We've talked a lot about in our group about the notion of the citizen, which you posit as a set of acts rather than as a kind of subject. And one of the questions that came up in a lot of our class discussions was, is that a kind of universality? Obviously, you're not positing a kind of universal citizen, regardless of borders. You're interested in how citizenship can be an act that, in fact, transgresses borders. But what you just said about a kind of citizenship that might be available to all of us does strike me as maybe a middle way between making something sort of available to all, yet not losing sight of a specificity, the specificity of those borders, of those limits, and also of those possibilities. A specificity that would be attentive to imbalances of power and privilege and access, while still having an availability that's spread wide, if that makes sense. So not universality in the way that would be a critique of citizenship as a model to aspire to, but something that is somehow available to all, which seems to be your faith in poetry. Poetry is an act of citizenship. Would that be a fair way of assessing how you approach that concept?
I think, well, I'd just say two things, and I'm not quite sure how they fit with what you've just said. I I'm not quite sure about universal. I think that the thing about the idea of the act, that citizenship could be an act. Like this, it's like having a point of resistance. You can resist, but you have to do something different after that, And you have to open up some other possibility, and then there'll be another point where some resistance is needed. But the thing about the act, and the act in Occidental is specifically deals with some issues around borders in Occidental in the Second World War, where people, when borders were closed to Jews escaping Germany, let people in anyhow. When like the consul, the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, get his name, I should know his name. It was a whole fine. He died in poverty, but he just sat in his car and signed visas for Portugal. He just signed everybody a visa from Portugal. He signed hundreds of these things. He just signed them. Come on, And it's just like, the thing about an act is it's a decision. You have to make a decision. You have to make a decision. You don't just say like, oh, I'm doing that because I was told to, and it's their fault. It's his fault. It's him. It's not me. And you have to, at some point, when somebody's demanding that you do something that is not ethical, you have to make a different decision. That is hard. You put yourself at risk. You put your family at risk. Put your job at risk. You have to decide. So that's where citizenship is an act. We have to feel for that face of a stranger, that Levinician face of the stranger. You have to accept the stranger on their terms, in a sense, without making them into somebody who's like us. We have to decide when we're going to say no and when we're going to just do something. And that's something that poetry helps us with. Poetry helps us with this because it helps us to think about paradox. It doesn't give us easy meanings. It helps us to think about ambiguity. It helps us to think about contradiction, and it gives us the power to take language somewhere else. So to me, it can help us make that decision, and it can help give us that power with language too, to make those logical leaps that are necessary sometimes in the moment of making a decision. And that's one thing I wanted to say about acts and decisions. The other thing I wanted to say is about borders, that I'm not, and Occidental is not advocating like the elimination of borders. Borders exist. There's societies that are structured, that have edges. Those are borders. On the other hand, a border only makes sense if it has some porosity. It needs a door. Because a border as a line needs an inside and an outside. If we're only inside and we never know there's an outside, we are going to wither and die. Our culture will die. We will come up with dying ideas. We will elect people who will make us die more when we shut borders. When there's porosities between borders, we allow something in that's not us, and it makes us stronger. And we all know that. I always used to go to Europe, and they would say, like, North America, like Canada and US, such lucky countries. And I would say, we are full of immigrants. That is why. We have let these things across our borders. Aristides de Souza Mendes. I just got on a note. I think I know who that is. Thank you. Yeah, that's the Portuguese consul in Bordeaux, who signed all the visas to let people into Portugal.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left in our Q&A, and I know that Lily has at least one more question that we wanted to get to, and I wanted to just acknowledge Jeff T. Johnson, who posted on Twitter that we might think about your translation work as a kind of cover song. So Jeff is someone who thinks a lot about music and musicology and poetics. So I had a feeling that he would have something to say about that notion of the set list. Lily, I know that we got a question from Caroline Bergvall. Would you be willing to share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Caroline. If you're
Hi, Carolyn, if you're still
Still
there,
awake.
still
And
awake.
yeah, we commend you. It's possibly 1 a.m. your time, or almost that. So I'm going to read Carolyn's question. She says, can Erin talk about the fact that she seems to be really increasing the amount of poets she is currently translating? How many books has she translated this year? I don't know how to count it. She is also broadening her geographical terrain within Spanish, Portuguese, Latin America. So how does she choose the poets she's translating now? Any serendipity stories about coming across some of them? And why is she accelerating this translation output? Is it to make sure to keep the borders wide open for poetry at this time?
Wow, I shouldn't even answer that. I should just say, that sounds so nice. I don't know. I get tangled up in translation, and then I think I'm going to do something that will be simple. But I forget that translating poetry, because you have to find the publisher, write tons of pitch letters, do this, do that, sort out the agreements between the parties. It's every hour I spend translating a poem, I have to spend 4 hours on the administration end of it. So I hate to say that this great explosion of translated poetry only appears to my great regret, because I'm going to have to do less of it, or I'll have no life. I mean, although the life of a translator of poetry is, aside from the fact that you don't make any money at all, it's great living with all these things. But so maybe I'll answer about how did I choose these poets? There's usually something personal that somehow links them. Like I don't have a copy of it here, a small pamphlet or chatbook out from Eulalia Press of translations from the Argentinian poet who died, I think, in 2014 or 2015, Juan Kelman, who's was the first Argentinian-born member of his family. His family were immigrants from Ukraine, from the Jewish immigrants from Ukraine. And there was something I was reading Oxen Rage, a wonderful translation of his work, Colorabue. And I was reading these poems that he had translated from John Wendell, the English poet. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's no such poet as John Wendell. Only Spanish people Argentinians would think that this was possible. And I realized it was kind of a heteronym, but instead of writing as John Wendell, he translated the poems of John Wendell into Spanish. And I found them full of this whimsical kind of Eastern European way of looking at the world. Because like, if you're in Eastern Europe throughout history, basically, like, you lose, man. So they have a way of, but they resist and they keep going. And different peoples there, different countries, but they have a kind of whimsical, ironic way of looking at the world that's different than the Western way of looking at the world, for sure. And I would catch these in these poems. In the translation, which was done by a young woman who worked with Hellman, actually, they're good translations, but what I was receiving from the original poems, I wasn't receiving from the translation. And so I was just translating the Spanish of Juan Hellman's, of John Wendell, and posted a couple of them on Facebook, because I knew I couldn't get permission to translate these again. And if somebody yelled at me, I could always take them off Facebook. And Michelle Gil Montero wrote to me from Pittsburgh and said, oh, like, can we do a chapbook? And I'm like, oh, that sounds really fun. So this chapbook came out. So I don't have a copy of it yet, but if you look on the Eulalia Books site, which is easy to find by Google, you could find where you can obtain that book. So there's always a little story like that. With Uxío Novoneyra, I wrote a little essay in the back, or a little statement in the back about that book, just to say what those links were. As an outdoor kid, that's me, one who grew up in the shadow of the Canadian Rockies and who has always lived with respiratory illness, I find a dwelling place in the language and poems of Uxío Novoneyra. He was asthmatic and he was sick for a long time with pleurisy in the 50s and 60s, and never ever completely recovered his youthful vigor. But as a child of a rural mother whose gaze lay with the land, even after she went blind, remember me in class saying, my mother would say, "You think the grass isn't writing." It's kind of scary. I do think the grass writes. Anyways, I read his poems with my fingers and my skin and my ears, and I feel the high wind in them. The book is wide and square to let the reader hold this space in their hand. So I talk about why I translated him, but it had to do with the idea of asthma and resistance too, because he went from a successful radio career in Spanish in Madrid. He returned to the Chorale and wrote from that point on in Galician and reivindicated Galician culture and language.
Well, on that note of asthma and grass writing and Galician, I want to thank Erín Moure for spending the day with us in conversation and reading.
Was so much fun. And thank you everybody who stopped by to listen on YouTube, and to the Phils of the future who will listen to the recording as well.
Thank you so much. This recording will be archived at the Kelly Writers House site. And thank you all for tuning in. Check back soon for another Kelly Writers House program. We would love, love, love to have you tune in. Have a great night.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody, and good morning.